After two decisive defeats for the Allies in Spain, they continued to enjoy success further north in France itself, with both armies having recovered from the bloody Battle of Malplaquet. What was to be the final, dramatic phase of the war began. Marshal Villars, leading the French army of Flanders, recovered from the near-fatal wounds he received at Malplaquet. His bravery and excellent leadership kept his place as the army's head. The Allied army is still led by the legendary Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy, two men whose skill, bravery, and careful planning routed the French in many a great battle, Malplaquet being their only major exception. Both men viewed each other as equals and even dear friends. But this companionship was not to last much longer. In the meantime, all that stood in their way were the fortresses of Cambrai, Landrecies, and Arras. If these were taken, Allied troops would be marching on to Paris. But after huge British losses suffered at Brihuega, Lille, Malplaquet, and La Godinia, the war drastically lost support in Britain, most notably amongst the Tory party, whose mission was to end Britain's involvement in the War of Spanish Succession, even if it meant preventing another glorious or costly victory for the Duke of Marlborough. In that year, the anti-war Tories defeated the pro-war Whigs in the year's elections. In Austria, Emperor Joseph I died only 5 years after his predecessor. Archduke Charles, knowing Spain can no longer be won, took the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in 1711. The British phrase, "no peace without Spain," no longer held any meaning. The years of 1710 and 1711 in the Low Countries saw the war become one of attrition. Fearing the outcry generated by the massive casualties at Malplaquet, Marlborough and Eugene relied on the economic superiority of the Grand Alliance, as well as the capture of key cities and fortresses along the Vauban belt. They achieved a great advance in these 2 years by fielding their armies earlier than that of the French. The fortresses of France held massive supply warehouses and magazines, and the capture of these meant greater logistical superiority over them. But as the campaigning season of 1712 opened and that of 1711 closed, the Allies suffered the loss of the Duke of Marlborough. He was removed upon charges of embezzling military funds, most likely a conspiracy created by the Tories to remove Marlborough from military control. Not only had Marlborough lost his position in the Grand Alliance's army as Field Marshal, but he had lost his majority in the House of Lords as well as his reputation. Prince Eugene arrived in England that year to testify for his dear friend, but it was all in a vain effort. In January of the same year, Marlborough was replaced by James Butler, the Duke of Ormond, a much less decisive commander, with much less of a connection to Prince Eugene. I concluded that the neck of war was broken, and that I should be disappointed in the pleasure of seeing Paris that year, though we were in hopes of arriving to the honor, wrote Corporal John Matthew of Marlborough's dismissal, and the dismissal of the British Army from the campaign. Marlborough's absence would prove devastating to Eugene and the Allied cause as a whole. The Duke was responsible for earning England a great reputation on European battlefields, contrasting its past of civil wars and limited expeditions. He and Eugene sewed together the divided and squabbling leadership of the Grand Alliance. He led men from all corners of Europe to victory, time and time again, against a kingdom which before seemed almost invincible. He left a legacy as one of the first great coalition commanders. John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, left a legacy that a certain 20th century descendant would ride in the world's darkest hour. But nonetheless, the advance to Paris needed to continue. And begrudgingly, the Allies pulled together. The Duke of Albemarle, the Dutch commander under Prince Eugene, gathered intelligence, reporting that the French were gathering massive magazines of forage and supplies in the remaining frontier fortresses. He and his fellow generals knew it was imperative to burn or capture these at any cost to deny the French an advantageous start to the campaigning season. And on the 1st of March, the Allies set out in their early style. With 16,000 men and 20 cannon, they enveloped Arras. With a heavy yet carefully aimed bombardment, they set ablaze the city's magazines. burning 1 million rations of forage. Despite this major setback, the French still planned on taking the field early to meet the Allies in battle, as well as hold strong positions in Arras, Landrecies, and Cambrai. They would at least force Eugene to bleed before achieving a breakthrough. Prince Eugene recognized the importance of seizing control of the Sanzé River. If not taken, a siege of Arras or Cambrai would remain impossible. On April 12th, Albemarle marched to the Sanzé, only to discover that the French infantry had been posted on all sides. Not only that, but the bridge there to Cambrai was too small for any army to cross. This issue forced a change of strategy for Eugene, and so he first concentrated the Allied army of over 100,000 men at Douai. This was without Imperial troops, which were delayed on their arrival to May 18th, creating yet another Allied setback. And on the 26th, the Allies then set out across the river from Bouchain. Albemarle posted 12 battalions and 26 squadrons of Dutch and German troops between Marchiennes and Denain. He and Eugene also created a new, yet vulnerable line of supply from Bouchain. Vulnerable, as the French could find one point to attack and achieve a breakthrough. Eugene did not let this detail slip from his mind though, and kept his army not too far behind for reinforcement. On May 28th, Allied pickets then reconnoitered the Scheldt River, hoping to find a crossing to Cambrai. The day after, a council of war was held by all of the Allied high command on their next move. During that meeting, Ormond suddenly revealed that he had received special orders not to engage any British forces in battle, and not to communicate this to his allies, but to Marshal Villars himself. Later, these orders became infamous and were nicknamed the War's Restraining Orders. With the frustration this generated, Eugene needed to intervene and calm the minds of Allied high command. Strangely enough, Ormond still agreed to cover the siege of Le Quesnoy, but not participate in it. The Allies quickly marched, enveloped, and besieged it. The city quickly fell on the 4th of July. But after the siege, Queen Anne proclaimed conditions of peace between Britain and France on the 17th of June. The French king rejected this offer, but all British troops were still ordered to march to Dunkirk and sail for home. Subsidy Prussian and Danish regiments, 30,000 to 40,000 men in all, refused to go. The Dutch agreed to pay for them instead. The British national troops, leaving, did not hurt the Allies so severely as they were only about 20 battalions and 20 squadrons in all in 1712. So Eugene, now having captured Le Quesnoy, then moved to Landrecies, hoping to take the French by surprise with a quick march. The city became enveloped on the 17th of July, but Eugene found it to be a much harder fort to crack. Landrecies was a much greater fortress than that of Le Quesnoy, and could be trusted to hold out before a relief army arrived. While Eugene concentrated his forces around Landrecies, Albemarle continued to guard the supply line with his smaller contingent. This decision left a very vulnerable and tempting target, that being the Allied supply lines which much of their supplies, siege guns, and line of communication traveled. This also allowed the French to attack at one concentrated point of their choice, while the Allies were obligated to spread their men along a 24-mile or 40-kilometer long line. Marshal Villars watched as it all happened. He received reports from dragoons reporting to Marshal d'Artagnan, who reported to Villars. With this information, he and Marshal d'Artagnan determined that the line between Denain and Marchiennes, held by Albemarle, would be the best point of attack when the time came. It only posted about 12 battalions and 26 squadrons of cavalry. Eugene also knew of this danger, but hoped he could quickly relieve Denain if it came under attack. Villars consulted with Versailles, and on the 19th of July he received orders from Louis XIV himself to relieve Landrecies in an open battle. On the 23rd at 6 p.m., the French army of 100,000 men marched with great secrecy and speed along a 19-mile or 30-kilometer long march. In the memoirs of Jean-Martin de la Coligny, a veteran of many of the war's greatest battles, wrote about the measures Villars took to maintain the secrecy of the army's march to the Scheldt River and Denain. 1,200 workmen were mustered and set to work to make roads along the banks of the Sambre in the direction of Guise. Although this was not the route our general had in mind to take us, to deceive the enemy still more, he sent some dragoons, who at fall of night took this road along the Sambre with measured tread, and so as to lead our opponents to believe that the whole of our army was on the march. They were accompanied by reliable men, extended at intervals, who shouted out in the darkness the names of our regiments, and drummers were posted here and there along the line who every now and then gave a few taps with their sticks, as if to recall scattered soldiery. On the night of the 23rd of July, the French army crossed the Scheldt River with pontoon bridges. Albemarle was doing the same on his end, opposite of the French. Both were finished by the following morning. Albemarle was completely unaware of how close the French had come, and did not launch a preemptive strike. Marshal de Villars was the first to cross with his cavalry wing. Behind him were the infantry of the Comte d'Albergati, the men who led the defense of the Bois des Sarres at Malplaquet. Behind the Allied line, the Prince of Tingey's infantry columns arrived and began deploying into line of battle, not intending to attack unless ordered. In the center, Villars arrived with the infantry of the Ardennes, and these two began deploying into line of battle, enabling an attack from the south and west. Villars' cavalry cantered further around Denain, and discovered that the Allied supply line which was left undefended, and so they occupied it. Albemarle was only informed of Villars' march around 8 a.m., and by that point his main line of communication to Marchian had been cut. It was imperative to him to take immediate action and throw back the deploying French with a sudden cavalry charge. He hastily mounted his horse and joined the now 30 squadrons of Dutch Imperial Cavalry under his command. His 6 cannon fired 1 shot each as a warning. The buglers gave the sound of boots and saddles, and as quickly as they could, put themselves to a gallop after mounting. Villars expected this and put his own cavalry into a charge. It was far too late to be thrown back across the Scheldt, and Villars' troopers engaged Albemarle's troopers. The French cavalry, emboldened by their success at Malplaquet, threw back and mauled the desperate charge by Albemarle. The fighting was short and one-sided, and at the worst time, a baggage train arrived from Bouchain. Not knowing of the ensuing battle, Villars' French cavalry then intercepted and captured the baggage train heading to resupply Denain. The confused escort and carters surrendered almost immediately. After this short engagement, Villars' army had nearly been fully deployed. He prepared himself and the men for the coming attack. At this time, Prince Eugene was informed of Villars' fast march. He would be heading toward the Prouvy Bridge with 40 battalions within just a couple hours. Villars was aware that Prince Eugene was not far away from Denain, and knew he had to attack as soon as possible. Albemarle's men had prepared defenses the days before, but few of them were complete, and this would make a scaling assault much easier for the French. At 10 a.m., Prince Eugene arrived, but with only 7 battalions from General Second. He ordered Albemarle's remaining squadrons to retire to the left bank of the Scheldt. The 7 battalions of the Imperial Army then took positions on the bridgehead with the Dutch troops. The rest of his army was further away, and he rode back to hurry them forward. Not long afterward, Villars finally ordered coordinated attacks from the south and west to begin. 3 batteries had been deployed by the French, which unleashed a heavy bombardment on the Dutch defenses. Albemarle responded with his mere 6 guns, but their fire proved ineffective against such a high volume of lead. The French guns smashed the poor defenses of Denain, creating some small gaps in the line. And so, the French lines in the west began their attack. Villars, d'Artagnan, and Albergati all led in person or on horseback. As the Frenchmen advanced within musket range, they were met with the whiff of grape shot and musket fire from the Dutchmen. The initially high volume of fire halted the first line of infantry, but they rallied and pressed onward. The first line responded with a volley along the entire line, which was composed of all pickets and grenadiers. It was about a half hour of savage fighting until the French pressed into the Dutch palisades at bayonet point. The French, being forced to attack a high ground entrenched position, took heavy losses. It is here that Marshal Villars stood up before his grenadiers and urged them on, waving his sword forward, leading by example. This action is immortalized in one of the most famous paintings of any 18th century battle by Jean Alou. His men cheered on, and grenadiers managed to launch grenades into the Dutch trenches. Albemarle tried to throw back this reinvigorated charge with bayonets, but to no avail. The last few defenders remaining at the palisades fired their last potshots before falling back with the rest of their comrades. The Allied infantry, facing such a ferocious and overwhelming attack, fought a panicked retreat. The first line had broken through and followed the Dutch closely. Initially, the Dutch stood against them in an intense melee. Some Imperial battalions attempted a flanking attack, but were repulsed by well-timed musket volleys, and were denied any success. Now that the French had achieved their foothold, they chased the defenders, chanting "Vive le Roi," or "Long live the King," as Albemarle's troops turned around and ran. French troops from the south had already joined in the fighting, and the Dutch retreat turned into a panicked rout. All of them had only one avenue of escape, that being the Pouvry Bridge, which was too narrow to fit very many men at once. The Pouvry Bridge became packed with men and horses running for their lives. Many men were pushed or shoved aside into the water. Horses clinged onto the sides of the bridge, but would never be able to lift themselves up and over. Cannons were brought across, and some fell into the river. Many fleeing Imperials and Dutch drowned, or were shot down by French infantry following behind them. Albemarle, unable to escape across the Pouvry Bridge, was captured by French soldiers. Prince Eugene finally arrived with the rest of his army. They attempted to relieve the broken Dutch, but were halted by Tingy's French infantry, which entrenched themselves to prevent a crossing. Seeing that Albemarle's army was shattered and the French had already taken the position with a superior force, Eugene reluctantly ordered a retreat. The Battle of Denain was incredibly short, but would prove incredibly decisive. The French had lost 865 men killed, and 1,075 men wounded, for an Allied cost of 2,400 men killed or wounded, and 4,100 taken as prisoners. These losses seem far lighter than the previous great battles of which the Duke of Marlborough was present for. However, the Battle of Denain had impacts far beyond casualties taken during the engagement. Prince Eugene felt it imperative to immediately retreat from Denain, not wishing to be pursued closely by French cavalry. Villars did not pitch tents for his army and set out immediately the following morning. Instead of relieving Landrecies immediately, he first attacked Marshal, the greatest supply depot of the Grand Alliance's armies. It quickly surrendered on the 30th of July, not anticipating such a fast march by Villars. It gave up over 100 cannon and its garrison of 9,000 men as prisoners. Horrified, Eugene raised the siege of Landrecies and retreated north. Villars followed and retook Douai on the 1st of August. Into October, Eugene would be forced from Mons to Seclin, as Villars recaptured Lake Quesnoy and Bouchain, costing the Allies another estimated 6,000 and 9,000 men, and an unknown but supposedly large number of cannon. By the 19th of October of 1712, Villars' offensive was complete. Villars and d'Artagnan's 1712 counteroffensive saw the French frontier reclaimed and secured as a result of one swift victory. It took years for the Allies to take these positions in long, bloody sieges, and now they were already back in French hands. Eugene, humiliated by his passive defense of the frontier and late arrival at Denain, took on a damaged reputation for the next several years. Louis XIV's court erupted with joy upon hearing the victory. The king himself personally thanked his courtiers for the very first time in his 60-year reign. The Sun King's realms were saved from defeat and occupation. had Villars been more positively received by those of high society in France, he would probably be known as France's restorer. The men that had been beaten so thoroughly by the partnership of Marshal and Eugene finally tasted what had been brought upon them for years from the other side. They didn't just regain their reputation, they had decisively beaten their enemy in detail. With the years-long Flanders campaign coming to a close, negotiations once more reopened between the warring powers. The Dutch Estates General, along with the British, tried for a separate peace. They began drafting the Peace of Utrecht, including terms now more favorable to France. Eugene was forced to march back to the Rhineland. Villars followed suit, and managed to capture the cities of Landau and Freiburg in 2 swift sieges. The two men then began drafting the Treaty of Rastatt between France and the Holy Roman Empire. In these 2 separate pieces, both sides agreed on the following main issues. 1. Naples, Milan, Sardinia, and Flanders would be ceded to the Austrians. This brought forward the largest extent of the Holy Roman Empire since the time of Charles V in the 14th century. The Spanish were reluctant to let these territories go, but they had long been conquered. 2. Spain would cede Minorca and Gibraltar to Great Britain, as they had never been retaken. 3. Spain would cede Sicily to Savoy as the Austrians promised. 4. France retains Landau and is given the Ubaye Valley and the Principality of Orange. 5. Philip V is given the throne of Spain, but would not unite with the throne of France. This isn't what Louis XIV sought after, but it did end hundreds of years of Habsburg influence over the Spanish Empire. So, who exactly won the War of the Spanish Succession? Why was it fought, and why should we remember it? Despite the territorial gains of Emperor Charles, he considered the loss of Spain and its possessions to be an unacceptable failure, and couldn't help but feel defeated for many years to come. France did not suffer any loss of territory on the mainland, but did not make any significant gains either. Britain made some territorial gains, but the only major claim would be Gibraltar. It would provide a great naval base that allowed for British naval dominance in the Mediterranean well into even the 20th century, and still remains British today. Philip V had won his place as Bourbon King of Spain. It did not matter much to him that he would not unite with his grandfather's throne in France, and still had to deal with the rebellious Catalonians. The war can reasonably be referred to as a stalemate, as neither side came out with a decisively advantageous position over the other. The War of the Spanish Succession was the first war where the hegemonic power of Louis XIV was seriously challenged. It was one of the first world wars that saw fighting on multiple continents, a topic this channel has yet to cover. It was one of the early modern era's shining examples of coalition warfare being used to great success. It ended hundreds of years of Habsburg dynastic rule over the Spanish Empire. The war introduced Britain once more as a great rival to France, and a force to be reckoned with on land and at sea. This rivalry set the stage for the next 100 years of colonial expansion and conflicts. Across the years, around 400,000 souls lost their lives in combat. With disease and other causes, the total would climb up to an estimated 1,251,000. This does not include wounded and captured personnel or civilians. The number is titanic for the age. The world had not seen such a toll since the 30 Years' War of the century before. Europe had been laid waste, all because of the death of one disheveled monarch. In 1715, the Sun King would die of old age, holding the record of longest reigning monarch at 72 years and 110 days. Although the War of the Spanish Succession would technically continue in Catalonia, the powers which kick-started this world war seized most of the fighting. Coupled with the rise of the Russian Empire in the east, a new era would begin for Europe and the world, the Age of Reason, or the Age of the Enlightenment.